You're listening to the weekly Parsha Podcast with Ari Goldwag, recorded with Hashem's never-ending assistance in Ramat Beit Shemesh, Israel, 779, 2019. This week's Parsha is Parshas Bo. I'd like to share with you a thought from Reb Chaim Friedlander. He quotes the Ramban. I'd like to share that with you as well. We'll read that inside. And here we go. He says, he lays down a foundation for us. What is the concept of Yetzias Mitzrayim? What are we supposed to learn from Yetzias Mitzrayim? Why are we always speaking about the exodus from Egypt? Throughout our days, Shabbos, Yontif, everything seems to be a restatement of the fact that God took us out of Egypt. What are we to learn from that? What is the message behind this? So he says it's a message of Emunah. It's a message of faith. Bo Chavokuk, he starts off and tells us, V'emidan al achas tzadik v'mnos yichya. The Gemara in Makos and Chavdalad tells us that if we were to define what is the most foundational concept of the entire Torah, so we could say that the foundational idea is the concept of Emunah. Tzadik v'emunas yichya. The righteous person lives with his faith and trust in God. B'daris harishonim kol mitzvah yicholos lahavias ha'adam el hashleimus. Says Reb Chaim Friedlander that in the previous generations, before Chavakuk came and said this is the foundation, so there were other things, there were other concepts that a person could find, could lead him toward perfection, toward greatness. By the time Chavakuk came around, so the hearts had become small, everyone had become not as great. Chavakuk comes and tells us that what is the mitzvah that brings us to shleimus, that brings us to perfection. That is the mitzvah of Emunah, the concept of faith and trust in God. Emunah hi mitzvah tzediris. Says Reb Chaim Friedlander, Emunah, the concept of faith in God, is a constant mitzvah. It's something that we have to do all the time. Ein lazman mesim lechiyuva. It doesn't have a specific time that one is obligated. A person is obligated to fulfill this mitzvah at every single moment. Not only is it possible to fulfill this mitzvah constantly, day and night, it's an obligation for a person to be living with this commandment, with this concept, constantly. It seems that if a person has an outlook of faith, of trust in God, it means that he trusts in God. So it would seem that by having faith, so a person can fulfill this mitzvah constantly, consistently. However, says Reb Chaim Friedlander, that seeing everything through the eyes of faith, seeing that everything comes from Hashem, that's just one aspect of Emunah. Shleimus ha'emunah eina hashkafa. Reaching the highest levels of faith in God doesn't just mean that you have an outlook and you see that God is with you, etc. Emunah hainu l'chiyos emunah. Having faith means living faith. What does that mean? Shekol orech hachayim hu mushtos al yedei azbonus tediris v'chizuk tediri. The entire course of a person's life is founded on the thought, the constant awareness and strengthening. She'emunah hi chaya etzlei b'leiv. Faith, emunah, belief in God has to be living in his heart. And here's where he says that we have, beyond the simple emunah, beyond the simple aspect of having faith in God, there's living with God, living with faith. And that means taking certain actions, that by taking those actions, it becomes clear that the person lives with this faith. Haradvaz Kosev, the Radvaz writes, that the concept of Emunah is that it needs to be set inside of a person's heart and in his soul constantly. Ubir Marino, Rav Dessler, Zatzal, and Rav Dessler explains, a person who is not constantly involved in trying to teach himself, incorporate into himself the faith that's necessary to have in Hashem, lo yeda oisa be'emes, he won't be able to know it in truth. He won't have that true conception of Emunah. Right? We have the obligation. How do we know that there's an obligation to have faith in God? Because God says, I am Hashem your God. I took you out of Egypt. You have to have faith in me. You have to trust me. That's the obligation. So without having this consistent and constant involvement and thought and contemplation, a person will not fulfill that commandment properly. So how does a person actively engage in Emunah? It's not just finding, believing in God and even believing that stuff that's going on in one's life is from God. But he says it takes it a step further, which has to do with the concept of bitachon. Bitachon means that I am taking actions that show, that prove, so to speak, that I believe that God is going to take care of me. Like Rabbeinu Yoina writes in Proverbs chapter 13, verse 26. He says, I'd like to explain to you what is the concept of bitachon, of trust in God. It's rooted in the concept of Emunah. Right? Emunah and bitachon are not the same thing. Emunah is faith, bitachon is trust, but it's a different aspect. What's the difference? Here we have it. It says, trust in God and do good. Right? It's connected. Bitachon is connected to action. Dwell in the land and be like a shepherd in regards to Emunah, in regards to faith. Says Reb Chaim Friedlander, when a person is shepherding, so to speak, he's involved in Emunah, in faith in God, in whatever circumstance he finds himself. Even when he's involved in his physical aspects, in his physical, that which is involved in his physical continuation, call it, whether it's his parnasa, whether it's his home, whether it's his relationships, all these things, if it's Hashem in there, is Hashem involved there? Does he recognize, is he bringing Hashem into his life? That is how a person attains a trust and a faith in God. And all of his actions are straight, as the verse says, and do good. Trust in God and do good. And he says furthermore, what is bitachon? It's having a very clear belief in God, strengthening the heart, Yeshuas Hashem Yisborach, that Hashem is going to save the person. And completely depending on it, in truth, really depending on it. Like the verse says, he trusted in God and he rested on him, he leaned on God. When Emunah is strong inside the heart of a person, so when a person has the faith inside, so it raises him up in levels of bitachon. Where does it come to play? So he still doesn't explain it yet, but he's about to. Chazal Amru, our sages say, it's a Gemara in Saited of Memches, Pasku Anshe Amana, that in the time of the Gemara, so those who were trustworthy, those who were faithful, we stopped having those kinds of people in the Jewish people. Yitzchak says, what are these people? Who are the faithful? Those are the ones who believe in God. Because of Rashi, Rashi explains, where does this come into play? Where is the action? Where is the show? Where is the performance of a mitzvah that proves that a person has faith? He explains, when a person is willing to give up his money in order to beautify a mitzvah, to give charity, in order to spend money on the Sabbath and on festivals, Rashi is explaining that it's not enough to have faith, but the faith has to express itself in actions. Person who has true faith, so he trusts in the promises of God to the point where he's willing to take a risk when it comes to his money. Specifically in regards to these three things, we have a promise from Hashem that a person will not lose out. Like Chazal say in Baba Kama Daf Tes, after a certain amount of money that a person spends, which is a third of the value of the item, if he spends it on making the item more beautiful in order to beautify the mitzvah, the commandment of God, so past that amount, Hashem is the one who guarantees the money. Barashi, a person will be paid back by putting out that money, showing that he has faith in God and having that desire to beautify the mitzvah. So the result will be that he'll be paid back in his lifetime. V'chein amru, Gemara in Tainus on Daf Tes, aser b'shvil shetis asher, when a person gives tithes, when a person gives tzedakah, charity, so it makes a person rich. It's a spiritual principle. And they learn it from the verse. The verse says, it's a verse in Yoel. Test me in this. God says, test me, you'll see that I will open up the windows of the heaven. I will pour out on you blessings. So many blessings. Gemara in Beitza, Daf Tazayin Amud Aleph, page 16a. All of the money that a person is going to have in his life, so it's all set for him. God has already decreed that on Rosh Hashanah exactly how much a person is going to make, except for the money that he spends on Shabbos and Yom Tov. When it comes to spending money on the Sabbath, the festivals, that money is not part of the deal. So a person can spend as much as he wants, he'll get paid back. That Gemara also says, the verse tells us that the joy of God is your strength. Amari, the Re says, it could be Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Yossi, I'm not sure. God says to the people of Israel, if you need to borrow money on the guarantor in order that you be able to have all of your needs for Yom Tov, for the festival, trust me, I will pay. But Rashi says, Chedvas Hashem, the joy of God, Simcha she'atem oisim b'shvil HaKadosh Baruch Hu, harei hi ma'uzchem. The joy, the festival that you make, to the extent that you make it joyous, that's your strength. Because you're going out of your way to make it a joyous time, the festivals, that will help you to be able to pay back the money that you borrowed. The money that you borrow for that. Kalaimar, the Reb Chaim Friedlander explains, to the extent that a person, he's meiser nefesh, he gives up of himself in order to, he takes a risk in order to be able to serve God with joy. To that extent a person merits that it's his power, that it's his strength. And interestingly, what's the strength? The strength is that a person sees that Hashem is with him. To the extent that a person trusts, like we saw last week, to the extent that a person trusts in God, to that extent, he's going to see that God is with him. Also in regards to beautifying the Sabbath and enjoying the Sabbath, the verse says, you're supposed to call Shabbos an oneg, an enjoyment. Loyas atzmai as levu alive ani porea. Same thing. It's not necessarily that the person has to do it themselves. It's done with God, as it were. God is part of the equation. God is part of making sure that it's paid back. Parshas Shel Yetzias Mitzrayim Beis Sefer Emunah. So here's where he gets to our topic, which is Yetzias Mitzrayim, the Exodus, and how foundational it is to us every single day, every single moment of our lives. The concept, the Parsha, the stories of Yetzias Mitzrayim, of the Exodus from Egypt, they are the school. This is the place that we learn all about Emunah, all about our faith in God. Like we said at the very beginning, I am Hashem your God, I took you out of Egypt. It speaks about the fact that we're to believe in God. Why? Because He took us out of Egypt. Why? When a person recognizes all of the concepts of the Exodus from Egypt, so a person can get a very clear conception, a very clear recognition of the fact that Hashem is our God. Ramban, here's where he quotes the Ramban. We'll see parts of it here in Reb Chaim Friedlander, and we'll see more of it together. The Ramban is explaining why it is that so many of the mitzvahs are zecher. They remind us. We put tefillin on our hands and our head. We have a mezuzah on our door. Inside of the box and inside of the mezuzah, it has verses that speak about Yetzias Mitzrayim, speak about the Exodus from Egypt. What is the concept? What is the idea? It speaks about this. We speak constantly about the miracles of the Exodus in Egypt in order that we remember that it's Hashem who is in the land. God is not like this far-off being who created the world and then let it run on its own. But rather, Hashem is intimately involved. We see and we prove from the Exodus from Egypt that God is intimately involved in our lives. This teaches us about God's divine providence. God didn't just let it be, just things flow on their own like some people think. The verse tells us, in order that you know that it's Hashem, the earth belongs to God. This teaches us that the earth belongs to God. That means that God created the world. They are His because He created them from nothing. The verse tells us, Hashem tells us that there is no one like Him. The purpose of the miracles of Egypt, the purpose of the makkos, the plagues of Egypt, it's all to teach us that Hashem is able. He has the power over everything. Nothing can stop Him. The entire purpose was to prove to the Egyptians who were doubtful, is there a God? Is there a power that's higher than our magical powers? Everything that God did came to prove to the Egyptians and to us that God is the one who is all-powerful. God is the one who created everything. He is the one who has power beyond any power that's created, beyond any person within the world. V'chein kasav harash, Chaim Friedlander says that we find that the Rush says this as well. There's an obligation to trust in God with all of your heart. To believe in God's divine and specific providence over each individual. And in this way, so we will be able to fulfill in your heart the complete yichud, which means recognizing that God is one and trusting in Him. That God is able to see all that's going on in the earth. Hashem sees the ways of each and every person, and He checks their heart, checks their thoughts. A person who does not believe that God took us out of Egypt, so he's also missing something in his belief that God is one. That's not a complete yichud. In order for me to be able to believe that God is one, I need to be able to believe that He took me out of Egypt, and He's involved in each and every aspect of my life. This is what is special about the Jewish people more than all of the other nations. And this is the foundation of the entire Torah. Like we said at the beginning, that the foundation of the Torah is faith in God, believing in God. And Emunah Yisrael, what is the faith of the Jewish people? Says Chaim Friedlander, that God is intimately involved in each individual person's life. This is the ultimate unification of God's name. It's the ultimate way that we prove that God is one. There is nothing else besides for God. And that's why the Ramban also says, and this is really the most amazing part of this piece, which this is why I'm reading it. That when a person believes with full faith, recognizes that God performed these miracles, these amazing, awesome miracles for the Jewish people, So by recognition of the miracles that God performed so long ago for the Jewish people, there's also an implicit recognition of the fact that God is involved in each and every one of our lives, performing all of the little miracles for us each and every day. The fact that our heart is beating, the fact that our eyes are working, the fact that we're breathing, the fact that we're alive, the fact that we have parnasa, that we have our livelihood, the fact that we have love, we have joy in our lives, we have relationships. All of these things are also miracles from Hashem. The Ramban says an amazing and important thing. He says a person is missing, or he says even more, a person has no portion in the Torah of God, in the Torah of Moses, until we believe in every matter, every single thing that occurs in our lives. Shekulam nisim, they are all miracles. There's no such thing as natural. There's no such thing as the way of the world. Whether we're talking about the general populace or whether we're talking about an individual, Hashem is involved. We are obligated to believe. And if we don't believe this, we're missing. We don't have a chelik. Not just we're missing something. We have no portion in the Torah at all. We have nothing without believing this. If a person doesn't believe this, he doesn't have a full recognition of God's oneness. Because a person believes that there is some other power in creation. There's only God. Before we accept upon ourselves the yoke of heaven, we ask God for help in unifying our hearts. We say to Hashem, please God, unify our hearts to love and to fear your name. And then we ask that God, please let us not be embarrassed forever. Because if our hearts are depending on other things, other people, other circumstances, other things besides for God, so we will be forever embarrassed for our foolishness. Emunah yavoda tadiris. He finishes off and says that Emunah is something which is a constant obligation to work upon. We can't live with yesterday's faith. We need to continue it even today. Sorry about that. We need to continue it even today. Each and every single day we need to strengthen ourselves, renew our recognition of Emunah-Faith, in order to merit, to get to the actual work, not just believing in God and not just having faith in God, but acting on our faith, as we said, giving charity, or whether it's being willing to spend money on the things that God promises He's going to pay us back for. Which is the Bitachon. And I had in mind to read from the Ramban, but really we read the main point in the Ramban, and I'll just wrap it up and say that the entire point, the Ramban says, of all of the mitzvahs, of all of the commandments, so many of them are connected to the idea of emunah, of trust and faith in God, reminding us of the Exodus from Egypt, of the fact that Hashem did these awesome miracles for us, brought us out of Egypt, and freed us, gave us the Torah. All of these things, all of these mitzvahs, whether it's tefillin, whether it's mezuzah, whether it's Shabbos, Kiddush, all of these things remind us to have faith in God and to remember that just like there were miracles in those times, Hashem performs for each and every one of us, each and every day, each and every moment, constant and consistent miracles. So I want to bless you, and I ask you to bless me. Hashem should help us. We should be zeich, we should merit to use the opportunities that we have every single day, so many times a day, of recognizing that it's Hashem who's involved in our lives, who gives us our food, who gives us our lives, who gives us the breath, who gives us our health, who gives us livelihood, who gives us our families. Hashem should help us to recognize that. Hashem should help us to use the opportunities that are involved in the mitzvahs, use the opportunities from when we were reading about these amazing miracles Hashem performed for the Jewish people in those times. Use the opportunity to recognize and remember that those miracles weren't just then. Those miracles are with us every single day. Thank you so much for listening. Have a wonderful Shabbos. This podcast was made possible through the gracious donations of listeners like you. For more podcasts like this, please visit www.arigoldwag.com or search on iTunes Ari Goldwag.